Vladimir, welcome. Welcome to VOC. And could we step back in time? You were 8 years old when the Soviet Union, when the Cold War came to an end, 10, I believe, when the Soviet Union started to crumble. But would you tell us a bit about your memories of being a child under communism?
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Patterson, for this very kind invitation. It's so wonderful to see so many friends in this room, and so wonderful to be here in the Brick and Mortar Museum for the victims of communism that Dr. Edwards and I discussed so many times in conversation over the years. And it's wonderful to see this dream realized in full and in such an amazing location too. So I look forward to coming back here to look at the exhibit the next time. Dr. Spalding, thank you so much for the welcome and for the kind words and for the opportunity to have this conversation. My Soviet memories are sort of more image-like as a child, you know, big portraits of Marx, Engels, and Lenin on the 7th of November or the 1st of May. These little red stars that school kids had to wear in the first 3 grades. Октябрята, the sort of the October movement, I guess you can say it. But then when it came time to, and of course, the food rationing cards too, which was a reality of our Soviet childhood, even in Moscow. And I can only imagine what it was like out in the provinces. But then when it came time to join the Soviet Young Pioneer Organization, which I guess is about, you do at 9 years old, there were 3 of us in our class, myself included, who refused to do this. And I remember we were sitting at the back of the class while everybody was writing this oath or whatever it was, and the teacher looking with eyes, you know, this big. But this was already towards the end of the system, and so it was a little easier to do than maybe for the generations previously. But talking about childhood memories, though, my first conscious memory, you can say my first conscious political memory, was the Russian Democratic Revolution of August 1991, the 3 days that ended the Soviet regime. I was not old enough to participate. I was only 10 at the time. My father spent all the 3 days and 3 nights at the barricades by the Moscow White House, along with other demonstrators who came out to defend democracy against this attempted KGB-led coup d'etat. So I wasn't old enough to participate, but I was certainly old enough to grasp and understand the importance of what was happening. And the lesson of those 3 days will stay with me for the rest of my life, because, you know, if you look at the way that coup started on the morning of the 19th of August, 1991, the balance was obvious, or seemed obvious, because on the one side, on the side of the leaders and the masterminds of that coup, you had the entire repressive machine of the Soviet Union. You had the army leadership, the KGB, the whole apparatus of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, all the propaganda machine, everything. They had everything. And the people, the Muscovites, the unarmed, peaceful demonstrators who came out onto the streets of Moscow, were not armed with anything except, you know, their own sense of self-dignity and their determination to defend their freedom and to not let it go again. And so they literally went out into the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and stood in front of the tanks on the streets of Moscow. And then the tanks stopped and turned away. Now, to me, this was just such an important and lasting lesson about the strength of civic courage, about the strength of a nation's dignity. And to me, this was a lesson that however strong a dictatorship may appear, when enough people are willing to stand up against it, they will prevail. And to add sort of to all the general impressions, our school, the school where I went to and where my wife went to too, we met in 5th grade, was on Lubyanka Square, near Lubyanka Square in Moscow, which is, of course, the site of the KGB headquarters. So we were just a few hundred meters from that. And as you remember well, so perhaps the most famous images from the Russian Democratic Revolution, August 91, was the toppling of the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Cheka and KGB. Of course, the problem was, which we can go into later on in this conversation, the problem was that it was limited to the statue. The actual organization was not targeted, and that's the reason for the reality we're living in today. But those were beautiful images. So the statue of the founder of this repressive criminal system of communist secret police being toppled by demonstrators and laid down on a truck. You remember those videos. And this was 2 minutes from our school. And so during recess, we would run over to watch the empty pedestal from the monument. And there was a wooden cross that somebody put up on top of that pedestal in memory of all the millions of victims of the communist regime and of the NKVD. And then the whole pedestal was covered with graffiti by Muscovites. And it was, down with the Communist Party. It was, end to the coup. And perhaps the most sort of visible graffiti was you had the swastika, the Nazi swastika, and then a hammer and sickle, and then a mark of equality between them. And that was put on the pedestal. This was September 91, just after the coup. And so these were my first vivid memories of just coming of age. And this was what shaped not just me, but many in our generation, I think, for years and years to come.
Just as an aside, I want to say that a personal mission for me at the Victims of Communism is that those symbols, the hammer and sickle, et cetera, become just as odious to our young people as the swastika. So I'm glad that you made that equivocation, that these terrible, evil, totalitarian regimes, they're just as evil. And we don't want to have any kind of glorification or idealization.
I think history made that equivocation. I'm just stating it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's part of what we're trying to do here. Before we leave your childhood and your family, you mentioned your father as being there at the barricades. And as I understand it, your father was a critic of the Brezhnev regime. And if I'm not mistaken, you actually had grandparents who were Latvian dissidents. Would you tell us a bit, is this the family business? Have you in a sense, grown up in an environment of pro-democracy, pro-human rights?
Well, I never thought of it that way, but I guess you can't run away from your genes, but also we are all shaped by our families in important ways and what people talk about at a dinner table and sort of the books people read, the books are on the shelves. And this is just part of who we are, I think. And yes, my dad was, he was a historian by education, just like I am. And like my granddad was his father, but he, refused to do any sort of work for the state in the communist regime. And only work he could do was work for the state because there was nothing else. So he, worked as a street cleaner, a street sweeper, somebody with a history degree from Moscow State University, but that was a way of protest. A lot of people among the intelligentsia did something like this. And so it was really funny always to look at his, there's this document in Russia, which by the way still exists to this day, that every adult person has called Trudovaya Knishka. So I guess you can translate it as your labor certificate or something, basically, which is a record of all the places where you worked and all the positions that they occupied. And so if you look at this document from my dad, it would say, street sweeper, and then the next one would be television anchor for the evening news program. Because when the 90s came and we had independent media, independent TV channels, he went to work for Russian television, which is where he worked until Putin's arrival to power until independent television was destroyed in Russia. Family history, of course, I only started to study it in detail once I grew up. Including going into archives, and it's difficult. It's much more difficult in Russia to go to the archives, much more difficult than, say, in the former East Germany, where it's freely available in other countries of the former Warsaw Pact. But you still can. You have to make an effort to do this. You have to collect all the documents to prove your direct relation, but you can. And so a few years ago, I went to the FSB archives to read the criminal case of my great-grandfather, who was arrested during Stalin's Great Terror in 1937 and executed in 1938. Very small case, just 2 interrogations. The first one where he denies all the absurd charges. And then the second one basically was just written by the NKVD interrogator. And then you can see the signature. You can see that the hand was shaking. So this must have been after torture. It was difficult to read, but I felt I had to, because it's not just history of my family, it's history of my country too. And in many ways, it's like a microcosm. And then just a few months, literally just a few months before my own arrest, I was at the the Russian State Archives in Moscow, the reading room, because I wanted to read the criminal case of my grandfather, whom I remember well as a child. He was also a historian. He was arrested in 1937 while he was a student at Moscow State University, charged with the infamous Article 58/10, which was anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, the most popular criminal code article in Stalin's time. And I was reading all the records there, all the sort of the documents, the indictments and so on. And so his official indictment, he received 8 years in the Gulag by a troika of the Moscow region. His official indictment stated that he expressed hostility towards the leaders of the party and the government. That was the official phrase. That was the reason for his sentence. And then fast forward to 2023, when I got my 25 years in prison, one of my articles of indictment was that I made statements hostile to the representatives of the highest authorities of the Russian Federation, including the president, end of quote. So they literally just even take phrases verbatim from these NKVD documents of the 1930s, very literally. And it's just, the history of our family, I think, is in a way just symbolizes what happened to our country in the 20th century and what unfortunately continues to happen to our country today.
Thank you for that and for sharing about your family. And you went from a fairly young teenager leaving Russia, going to the United Kingdom to study for your undergrad and master's degree, became a historian, a writer, published your first book years later after almost a decade as a young journalist. Would you tell us about, once you got to the United Kingdom, how did your views, how did your outlook on your country change? What did you learn from being, in a sense, outside of the system about Russia?
It was, of course, it was eye-opening, as it always is when you have different perspectives, and I'm grateful for that experience in my life, both the studies in England and then also for the years I've worked as a journalist in this town, in the US, because it's, you can't really have an opinion about something unless you experience it, unless you see it. I was fortunate to be in one of the great universities that allowed me as a historian, the research, the access to research was amazing, something that I really valued while I was there. But the focus of my studies was always on Russia continually, and the thesis of my dissertation at Cambridge was about the first Russian parliament, the first Russian State Duma, back in 1906, when we had a constitutional monarchy for a brief time after the defeat of the Tsarist regime in the Russo-Japanese War. And then I turned it into a book. So I was grateful for that opportunity to have access to these sort of the academic resources that gave. And of course, England's a very nice country to be in and to see, as you know. And I greatly respect the parliamentary tradition, which is, I think, something that, of course, we have to strive and aspire to in our own country too. But it was always temporary, and as soon as I graduated from university, I basically hopped on the first plane and went back home to Moscow. In that same year, so I graduated in the summer of 2003. In December of 2003, we had a parliamentary election in Russia in which I ran. I was a candidate for the Russian State Duma in a district in the south of Moscow, representing two pro-democracy opposition parties, one led by Boris Nemtsov, the Union Right Forces, and one led by Grigory Yavlinsky, Yabloko. I was proud to have been the only joint candidate of these parties that famously or infamously quarreled with each other, even though the basic ideological tenets were the same. Unfortunately, that's a problem with many opposition forces in post-Soviet countries, as you know. But that election was in many ways a historic one because it really marked a turning point on Russia's transformation from the imperfect democracy that we had under President Yeltsin back in the 90s to the perfect dictatorship it is today under Vladimir Putin. In the famous description of Sir David Atkinson, who was head of the Council of Europe Observer mission at that election in Russia in 2003, he said that election was free, but it was certainly not fair. And that's what made it a transition one, because it was free in the sense that somebody like me could still be on the ballot. I mean, today that's impossible. And there were real opposition candidates on the ballot, but the result was already pre-decided and predetermined. And the result of that election was the expulsion of any genuine opposition from the Russian parliament. And when that Duma, that newly elected or elected Duma first met in December of 2003, its speaker, Boris Gryzlov, one of the leaders of Putin's United Russia Party, said his famous phrase that parliament is not a place for discussion. And I think that's going to be one of the phrases that will really go down describing the Putin regime in future history books.
5 years later, I was on a short visit to St. Petersburg and Moscow, and we were told, the group that I was with was told the same story over and over as a joke. And the joke was, and this is when there had been an election, the next election, and Vladimir Putin went to be prime minister, and Dmitry Medvedev became the president. And the joke that I must have heard 20 times in hotels, in restaurants, was that a security guard walked into the room, and these two men were sitting apart from each other playing chess. And the security guard said, "Mr. President." And the two of them looked at each other and laughed. "Is that you this year? Or is it me this year?" And it was this joke that nothing had really changed, and that actually Vladimir Putin was still pulling the strings. Would you tell us a little bit more about this transition over that next decade? First, of the opposition being edged out, it being under democratic pretenses. Well, this is the will of the people, et cetera, et cetera. And then you called it a perfect dictatorship earlier. Would you talk a little bit more about that process as you observed it?
Well, you're very right to say the word process, because the dictatorship under Putin was not established in a day. It wasn't a coup d'etat or a military takeover or whatever, the way this has been known to happen in other countries. It was a gradual process. And it took a while, but the direction was never in doubt from the first moment. Putin's goal was always very clear. And it was only a question of time and of what resistance he would or would not meet from our own society in Russia and also from the leaders of the democratic West. And unfortunately, especially in the early years, he really met with no resistance from either. When Putin came to power, he decided to follow Mussolini's tactic that he used when he established the fascist regime in Italy in the 1920s. Mussolini's advice was, you have to pluck the chicken feather by feather to lessen the squawking. So in other words, don't try to do everything at once, do it gradually and incrementally. And so Putin began with independent media. We have a saying in Russian, "Кто нас обидит, 3 дня не проживет." Those who will offend us will not survive for 3 days. Almost in exact keeping with this saying, on the 4th day after his inauguration as president of Russia in May of 2000, Putin sent armed operatives from the Prosecutor General's office and the tax police to raid the headquarters of Media Most, which was the largest private media holding in Russia at the time, parent company of NTV, which was the most popular, most prominent independent television network. Within a year, NTV was forcibly seized by the state, becoming just another mouthpiece of propaganda as all the other channels. Within 3 years of Putin coming to power, by 2003, every single independent nationwide television network had been either closed down or taken over by the state. He then moved against the political opposition. I mentioned already the election in 2003. That was in many ways a turning point year, 2003. So with that election, he basically turned Parliament into a rubber stamp, a meaningless institution that just approves automatically whatever he wants, which is still the case today. And then from the sort of political persecution of his opponents, he moved to actual persecution in a literal sense of this word. The 1990s were the only period in the modern history of Russia when we had no political prisoners. So in the 1990s, people were not sent to prison in Russia for having views that differed from the views of the government. This was a unique period of time. As soon as Putin came to power, we saw the appearance of first political prisoners. First, it was just a handful, then maybe dozens. And again, going back to this idea of a turning point in 2003, that was, of course, the year when Putin arrested Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was one of his chief rivals, Russia's richest businessman, who openly challenged the regime and funded opposition parties, funded independent media, civil society groups. He was arrested in this sort of a very demonstrative early morning raid by FSB operatives on his plane as he landed for refueling in Novosibirsk airport. And the next day after he was arrested, he was paraded in a courtroom of the Basmanny district court in Moscow, sitting literally in a cage with metal bars. The richest person in Russia sitting in a cage, paraded on national television. And this was, of course, a wider message to the Russian business community, that if you behave like him, you will end up like this. And the message was heard loud and clear. And since that time, no major business leaders ever attempted to challenge the Putin system. And so by about 2004, the construction of the authoritarian regime was complete. But then what was another red line, another turning point to my mind, when authoritarianism turned into totalitarianism in Russia, was the night of February 27th, 2015, when Boris Nemtsov, the leader of the Russian pro-democracy opposition, was the most prominent, the most effective, the most well-known internationally leader of the face of the democratic resistance in Russia, former deputy prime minister, once seen as likely successor to President Yeltsin. In full disclosure, also my closest friend and my mentor and godfather to my younger daughter, when he was gunned down, assassinated on Putin's orders, literally in front of the Kremlin wall, a couple of 100 yards from the Kremlin wall. This was the most high-profile political assassination in the history of modern Russia. And of course, since then, as Anna was saying in her introduction just a few minutes ago, also in February of this year, it's a cursed month in modern Russia, February, the murder of Boris Nemtsov, the murder of Alexei Navalny, and the start of the war in Ukraine. February 16th of this year, when Alexei Navalny was murdered on Putin's orders in that Arctic penal colony. And so today, what we have is not a authoritarian regime. It's not just a corrupt regime. It is a regime of murderers in a very literal sense of the word. And this is where these 25 years have led us. And as I mentioned, to my mind, the responsibility for allowing the Putin regime to grow into the monster that it has become today, initiating and leading the largest military conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War, which is what's happening in Ukraine. The responsibility for allowing them to grow into this is shared between Russian society, a large part of which, for the initial years of Putinism, chose to take this unspoken social contract, where people would agree to give up their political rights and freedoms for higher economic living standards. That's one part of it. But the other part of it, and the other share of the responsibility, I'm absolutely convinced, belongs to the leaders of Western democracies, including American presidents of both political parties, who have for years turned a blind eye on Putin's domestic abuses and also his aggressive ventures abroad, in a hope of finding some sort of accommodation with him. But we know from history what the appeasement of dictators leads to. We know it from the history of the 1930s, and we know it also from the 25 years of the history of Putin's rule in Russia.
Could we explore those two groups just a little bit more? Because just a few moments ago, you talked about the grit, the determination of Muscovites in the early 1990s, the overthrow of the old Soviet Union, the vivid picture of tearing down the statue. And that happened in so many post-communist countries, the tearing down of these statues. What was the first thing that the Hungarians did in 1956? The big Stalin statue coming down, right?
Street,
yes, and then dragging the head around.
With a broken nose.
Exactly. So would you tell us just a little bit more about the evolution of this social contract? Why did people buy into that? Did they realize it was happening at the time? Is it because the 1990s were actually so hard? Or was it, is this something that there was a spurt of investment in the country? I mean, what is it that allowed this social contract to take root?
Well, this question, Dr. Patterson, actually goes to the core mission of this institution where we are in, everything that you dedicate your work to. Because, President Yeltsin and his government have been blamed for a lot of things, for corruption, for the loans for shares scandal, for this and that and the other, for listening to Western advisors too much or whatever. I mean, there's all these criticisms flying around out there. And I'm sure there probably is some substance in each of them. But to me, the biggest, the most fundamental, the most catastrophic and consequential mistake committed by President Yeltsin's government in the early 90s, by Russia's democratic government, was their unwillingness or their inability to fully come to terms with the Soviet past. Because we know from the examples of the many countries in the 20th century that have successfully transitioned from dictatorship to democracy, that a necessary condition for success on this road is a public reckoning, a public reflection by society with the crimes that had been committed by the previous regimes, in order to make sure that that evil never returns again. Because if evil is not publicly reflected on, publicly accounted for, and publicly condemned, it will come back. And so we saw these processes, what lawyers sometimes refer to as transitional justice. We saw them in different shapes and forms in South Africa after apartheid, in Argentina after the military dictatorship, in Czechoslovakia, Poland, other former Warsaw Pact countries after the collapse of communism. Of course, in Germany after 1945, and then again in the eastern lands after 1989. Different ways this was done, not without criticism, but these measures generally worked. We had nothing of the sort in Russia. We had some initial first steps. There were people at the time, this is important to say, this is not something we're talking about 30 years after with hindsight. There were people at the time who realized just how crucial it was to do this. One of the people who was sort of most important in this was Vladimir Bukovsky, a name well known in this building, a very prominent writer, dissident, longtime political prisoner who spent 12 years in the Soviet Gulag. Russia's answer to Václav Havel in many ways, he could have been. He was expelled in a prisoner exchange of the same kind that liberated us back in December 1976. This was the first of its kind. And so in 1991, he returned to Russia, and he just worked tirelessly trying to convince President Yeltsin and his government to open the archives, to publish all the crimes committed by the Soviet system, to bring to accountability the regime that had committed these crimes. Not to imprison individual people, that wasn't the point. As Bukovsky wrote in his book, Judgment in Moscow, the goal was not to have a gulag in reverse and to start jailing all of them. No, that wasn't the point. The point was to condemn the regime, its lines, its policies, its everything he was doing. And needless to say, dismantle institutions that had been committing these crimes, like the KGB. Galina Starovoitova, a very prominent lawmaker from St. Petersburg, introduced, this was in 1992, introduced a draft lustrations bill into the Russian parliament, modeled on policies that had already been implemented in Czechoslovakia at that time, whereby people who were directly implicated in the crimes of the old regime, who occupied high-ranking positions in either the Communist Party or the KGB, would be limited, barred from holding positions of power in this new democracy. A necessary self-defense mechanism, again, something that was done in many countries of the former Warsaw Pact, but not in Russia. And same year, 1992, so same year when Bukovsky was arguing for the opening of the archives, when Starovoitova was introducing a illustrations bill, Judge Anatoly Kononov from the Russian Constitutional Court published a legal opinion in which he argued for conducting a trial of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union based on the international legal statutes that were already there at the time when the Soviet Union existed, statutes concerning crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes, crimes of aggression, and so on, basically arguing for a legal basis for some sort of a Nuremberg-style trial against the communist regime. As we know, none of this happened. Bukovsky's arguments fell on deaf ears. Kononov's legal argument was never put forward. Starovoitova's illustrations bill was never considered by the Russian parliament. And when Bukovsky was leaving Moscow, about 92 or 93, he said to Yeltsin's ministers that you're going to regret this. You're going to regret this, and, because you'll see where this leads us. And they sort of, shook their heads, and they said, no, what you're proposing would be a witch hunt, they said to him. And he looked at them and said, well, mark my words, in a few years, the witches will come back and start hunting us. And this is exactly what happened. One of the first things that Vladimir Putin did when he came to power, as he was coming to power, I should say, because this was still in December 1999, when he was still prime minister, December 20th to be precise, he went to Lubyanka Square, the site of the KGB headquarters, to officially unveil a memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov. Now, Andropov was someone who symbolized the worst of the Soviet system, both in terms of the external aggression and in terms of domestic repression. He was ambassador to Budapest in 1956. You mentioned the uprising. He was one of the people responsible for the invasion and for the bloody suppression of that uprising. And as longtime chairman of the Soviet KGB, Andropov prioritized fighting domestic political dissent in the KGB's operations. He was the one who set up a special directorate. It was called the Fifth Chief Directorate of the KGB, tasked with suppressing political dissent. He was the one who expanded the horrific practice of punitive psychiatry when dissidents were declared mentally insane and kept in torturous conditions in psychiatric institutions. He was really a symbol of all of it. And, Russia's a country of symbols. And Putin could not have chosen a more potent one to signal the direction of his rule by unveiling a memorial plaque to him. This was the 20th of December, 1999. That was the day I realized who that man was and which direction he was going to lead our country. And so the answer to your question, Dr. Patterson, is this is how Putin became possible. Because Russian society never really went through this process of public reckoning and public reflection and public accountability. And there's an important lesson in this for the future. I'm not just talking about it because it's in the past. I'm a historian, I love talking about the past, but that's not why I'm talking about it now. There will be another window of opportunity for change in Russia, I think in a very foreseeable future. None of us knows exactly when or how. Russian history is famously unpredictable. Both the Tsarist and the communist regimes fell down in 3 days, literally, not a figure of speech. And the next time that window of opportunity comes, we cannot miss it in the same way it was missed in the 90s. Because we owe it not just to our own citizens, but to the whole world to make sure that next time the democratic transition in Russia is implemented successfully.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of sympathy for that very, very specific analysis that you've given. And I want to let you know that Dr. Edwards, in 1968, I believe, hosted at Georgetown University a Crimes of Communism Tribunal. And he had the foresight to recognize the need to do that, not just publicly, but as a way to engage students in thinking about this. And it's something that we plan to resurrect in the days ahead here. So very, very well done. And yes, necessary processes of transitional justice and lustration have been hugely influential in other places. Could we talk just briefly about that other side, and that is the complicity, in a sense, of perhaps the West looking the other way? Certainly the early 2000s, the West thought it was going to be focusing on China, and instead 9/11 happened and a variety of things. One could argue there were other dimensions, thinking about energy from a supplier that's outside of Europe and outside of the Middle East, a variety of reasons that the European countries and the United States might choose to think that Russia's not that bad of a threat, doesn't need to be engaged in that way. They have an authoritarian political culture. That's just how they are. A lot of excuses. How would you respond to and could you tell us a little bit more about the West looking the other way during that decade?
Absolutely. Well, just to seize on this last point you made, that one of the excuses put forward that, this is just how Russians are, that this is an authoritarian tradition, whatever. Well, first of all, that's really insulting as Russian citizens to listen to such sort of, so-called arguments being put forward. And you're right. We do hear this from time to time. And I think, but also as a historian, I can say that it actually is not true, because the few times when Russian citizens actually were allowed to have a free choice between democracy and dictatorship, they invariably chose democracy. 1906, the election to the first Russian parliament that was won by the Constitutional Democrats, which was a pro-reform party, which wanted to transform Russia along the lines of a British-style constitutional monarchy. They won that election in a landslide, and supporters of Tsarist autocracy failed to win a single seat. This is 1906. 1917, November 1917, elections to the All-Russian Constituent Assembly, the first ever election held in Russia on the universal suffrage. It was held after the Bolsheviks seized power by force in October coup d'etat, and they lost that election to parties that advocated for a democratic republic as opposed to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Of course, the assembly was disbanded by force. And going back to 1991, something that I remember myself, June of 1991, the first ever direct election for head of state in a 1,000-year history of Russia, when Boris Yeltsin, representing the pro-democracy opposition, defeated former Soviet Premier Nikolai Ryzhkov, candidate of the then ruling Communist Party of the Soviet Union, by 57% to 17%. These are facts as opposed to stereotypes that you quoted and referenced. And thank you for doing this, because we do still hear this from time to time. And the best response to this so-called argument was given by President Reagan in his Westminster address in 1982, when he said, and I often quote those words, when he said that it is cultural condescension or worse to suggest that there's a single nation on the face of this earth that would prefer dictatorship to democracy. This was said 4 decades ago, more, but these words ring just as topical and as true today as they did back then. This was just an aside because I couldn't not seize on that point. But to your question about Western complicity, and it is complicity. It is enabling, it is appeasement, and it is complicity. And this sort of flows appropriately from where we ended in the previous question about Putin opening that plaque to Andropov. Because very often in expert circles, but also in circles of policymakers who sort of want to make excuses for the policy of the early 2000s of Western appeasement of Putin. People try to say, oh, but Putin changed. He was different before. There was an early Putin and a late Putin. No, he didn't. He was the same from the day he volunteered in the 1970s to go and join up the Soviet KGB. That Plakton drop-off, December 1999. And just in case anybody still had any questions, in the first year of his presidency in 2000, Putin brought back the Stalin-era Soviet national anthem as a national anthem of Russia. Again, Russia's a country of symbols. And this answered all the questions. And very quickly, as we already discussed, symbols turned into actions as he started moving against independent media, against political opponents, rigging elections, and so on and so forth. But what did we see at that time from leaders of the countries that pride themselves on, standing on such notions as rule of law, democracy, and respect for human rights? Did we see them standing up for these principles when it came to Russia? No, we didn't. What we saw instead was Western leaders inviting Putin for international summits, making deals with him, legitimizing him in the eyes of the international community, of course, buying gas and oil, but also on a personal level. The messaging, that's really important, because that's what, when we talked about the fact how Putin started this incrementally and carefully, because he was watching for the reaction. And the reaction he got, for everything that he was doing, was that, one American president looked into his eyes and got a sense of his soul. Another American president of a different party pushed a reset button with him. One German chancellor literally sold himself to Putin, and still continues to do it to this day. But what was really really vivid and visible and demonstrative to me, maybe because I experienced it with my own eyes. So back when I was working as a journalist in London, this was 2003, just before I went back to Russia. In June of 2003, June 22nd to be precise, Vladimir Putin's government pulled the plug on the last independent nationwide TV channel in Russia, called TVS. So it was the last TV channel that provided objective, truthful information to Russian citizens. They shut it down. So all television was monopolized by the state. This was a big deal. This was the first time since the end of Soviet rule when the state in Russia controlled all television. It hasn't happened for more than a decade. Or when I say this was a big deal, I should have said this should have been a big deal. But apparently for many Western leaders it wasn't. Because literally 2 days after Putin pulled the plug on the last independent television channel in Russia, he was treated to a lavish state visit to London. And I was covering it as a journalist, so I remember it. And to a ride down the Horse Guards Parade with the Queen, and a banquet at the London Guildhall with people raising glasses and singing, "Oh, he is a jolly good fellow," and multi-million contracts signed with the City of London and so on. What message should he have got? That it's okay, that I can do whatever I want. And so, as I already mentioned, and I want to repeat this, a large share of the responsibility for what Putin has become today, for the monster that his regime has grown into, lies with those Western leaders who, instead of standing on principle and defending these notions of democracy and human rights and respect for the rule of law, which they were supposed to defend, chose to turn a blind eye and continue to do business as usual with Vladimir Putin. This is a result of it today.
Yeah. Wow. Well, our staff is collecting questions. Let me ask you one question as we make a bridge to questions from the audience. But I bet this question is in here. You've talked about others who, in a sense, have been martyrs of communism, attacked by the regime, imprisoned, murders. We haven't really talked about your own experience, an experience that's been very inspirational to many people outside in the West. Poisoned once, in a coma for 30 days. In your own words, everything shut down in my body. Poisoned again. And then you went back to Russia and went through this trial with this incredible, this draconian verdict, a verdict that's almost double most other crimes, 25 years sent to prison. How did you survive all of this? And what made you go back? I've heard you give interviews on this topic, but would you talk to us a little bit about what made you go back and continue to fight for democracy in Russia?
So first on the sentence, 25 years. This was the longest sentence for any political prisoner since the death of Stalin, since 1953. That hasn't happened before. And it was sort of, I don't know if I'm going to be able to find out like a word to describe how that felt. I mean, it felt totally surreal, right? Because nobody can survive that. So it was just some figure. But I remember on the day of my sentence, which was last April, I was, after the verdict was announced by the judge, I was being led down by the police convoy in handcuffs to the basement of the Moscow City Court, where there are cells for prisoners. And so in my sentence and in my indictment, the 5 articles of a criminal indictment, which then became the 25-year sentence, were 5 public speeches that I made. 2 against the war in Ukraine, 2 against domestic repression and political assassinations in Russia, and 1 against the illegality of Putin overturning the constitutional term limits to stay in power indefinitely. Because we're supposed to have 2-term limits, just like you do in this country. But obviously he's been in power for 25 years. And so 5 public speeches. And so when the verdict was announced, I was being led down the staircase, and this police officer, the head of the convoy, turned to me and said, "So let me get this right. You just got 25 years in prison for 5 public speeches?" I said, "Yeah, I guess I did." He turned to me and said, "Well, I hope they were good." I said, "Well, that's probably for them to assess." And then another one, just to sort of illustrate how Kafkaesque the actual sentence was. When I was on the way to Siberia in September of last year, it took 3 weeks. The journey that we've all read in Solzhenitsyn and Soviet dissidents, Stolypin carriages, transit prisons, nothing changes. Everything is exactly the same. So in one of the transit stops, I think it was in Samara, when so I was put in a paddy wagon to be taken to the train station and on further east, and locked up in sort of this individual little tiny cubicle inside the paddy wagon. But the convoy was okay. I mean, they didn't really prevent people from talking to each other, which they normally are supposed to. And so different prisoners in these different sections of the paddy wagon started getting to know each other, introducing themselves. And so the way it went, they would say, the name such and such, even of whatever article such and such of the criminal code, 7 years. Or, Petrov article such and such, 9 years, and so on. Okay, so it came to my turn. And I said, Vladimir Kara-Murza, article so-and-so, 25 years. And then there was a deafening silence in the paddy wagon. And after about 15 seconds, somebody said, "What did you do, man? Did you eat people?" I said, "No." I said, "No, I didn't. I just spoke out against Putin and against the war." But anyway, we are back to really Stalin-era sentences, not Brezhnev era. I mean, the highest sentence in Brezhnev's time for a dissident was the 13-year sentence for Natan Sharansky, whom I met with last week. He's an amazing person. He got 13 years also for high treason. We're fellow traitors with him. But 25, that goes back to Stalin's time. But the two of your substantive questions. First, what made me not leave and stay in Russia? To be honest, that question never even occurred to me of leaving, because look, I'm a Russian politician. This is what I do. I've been doing this for 25 years. I came to work with Boris Nemtsov in November of 1999, actually this month, 25 years ago. I believe in what I do. This is not just work. This is my life. And I feel that those of us who are public politicians, we have a responsibility before our fellow citizens that transcends any considerations of personal safety and personal comfort. How can I call on my fellow Russian citizens to stand up and resist this dictatorship if I'm not doing it myself? That's not possible. We have to share the same risks. Otherwise, it's hypocrisy. At least that's how I always felt. And this was the case for many people. That's why Boris Nemtsov never left. That's why Alexei Navalny never left. I mean, this is not something unique. There are many people who have done this because, well, how could we do anything else? And so I felt that it was my duty and my responsibility as a Russian politician, especially with this massive crackdown, this new wave of repression that started after Putin invaded Ukraine in February 2022, is my responsibility to stay and to show that we're not going to be scared off, we're not going to be running away. To me, the most important lesson from the Soviet dissident movement was that they showed that at the end of it all, fear is a choice. Even though the regime, the system, tries to make you afraid, each individual still has a choice of whether he or she will be afraid or not. I remember back in 2007, when I ran Vladimir Bukovsky's presidential campaign. There was this initiative, which of course mostly symbolic and moral. We knew he would never be allowed on the ballot. But there was an initiative group of the Russian opposition, which included me. I was the chair of it. We nominated Vladimir Bukovsky for president of Russia. And there was a big rally we held on Mayakovsky Square, which is the same place where the dissident movement was born back in 1960. So it was symbolic to choose the place. And there were quite a few people, a few hundred people. And then after that rally was over, a lady came up to Bukovsky and asked him, why did you decide to return to Russia? Do you really think you can change anything? And he looked at her and said, no, of course I don't. But I came back because people are starting to be afraid again. And when people are starting to be afraid, you have to come in, stand next to them and say, here I am, I'm not afraid. Because fear is a choice. And we have to, I think those of us who are the public faces of the opposition, the only way to show something is with personal example. Otherwise, what would it all be worth? So there was never any question of leaving. And on your final question about what helped survive in that Siberian prison, I would say three things. First is my Christian faith, because I know that at the end of the day, everything is going to be decided up there, not by some people who think they own everything. Secondly, my education as a historian. Perhaps it never came as useful to me in my life as it did when I was in prison, because especially rereading those books and memoirs by Soviet dissidents, we know how that story ended. This will end exactly the same way. If these people think they're forever, they're in for a big surprise. And so that really helped knowing how these models are there. The laws of history are there. As I said, you can delay it a little bit, but you cannot stop it. And Putin's not going to be an exception. But the third thing I would say, about 20 years ago, I was making a documentary film about the Soviet dissident movement. It was called They Chose Freedom. It's a 4-part TV documentary. And I interviewed a lot of the people for that film, which I was really happy I've done, because most of them are no longer with us, but they're preserved on the screen. And when I was interviewing Bukovsky, I asked him the same question you just asked me: what helped you going? What helped you, sustain yourself in the Gulag and the prisons and labor camps and so on? And he looked at me and he answered very briefly. He said, I knew that I was right. I knew that I was right. And at the time, I thought this is just a nice sounding phrase. And I've put it in a film because it sounded good. But now, having gone through this myself, I know just how important that is. Because once you know that you're right, I knew every minute of every day I spent in that prison cell, I knew that the real criminals are those people in the Kremlin who started this war, not those of us who are in prisons because we opposed it. I knew that I was right. And once you know that you're right, the fear and the doubt, they just go away.
Wow. Thank you for that. You've mentioned the war multiple times. We have multiple questions about the war. So would you tell us a little bit about, it's really been a decade of war. Right. And where we are today, how you see this. Is it undermining the regime? Is it reinforcing the regime? Are there things that we in the West, particularly kind of the average American citizen, don't really understand about the dynamics of this conflict?
Well, first of all, let's sort of recall that it's really been 25 years of war, because Putin came to power on the back of a brutal war in Chechnya, which was what propelled him to the Kremlin. Then it was Georgia, then it was Ukraine the first time, Crimea and eastern Ukraine, to what you just referred. Participation in the war in Syria, then the full-scale invasion in 2022. This man, for every year of the 25 years he's been in power, he's brought pain and suffering and blood and death with him. And he's not going to stop until he's stopped. And so to your question about this, the war in Ukraine. Well, first, it's important, I think, to state outright that Vladimir Putin failed in his original objectives, because we all remember what the Kremlin guys were saying in February of 2022. Kiev in 5 days, and eliminate Ukraine as a functioning, sovereign, independent country. Well, very clearly, none of these goals have been achieved. In fact, instead of that, for the first time since the Second World War, we actually now have foreign troops on our own territory. And I mean real, internationally recognized Russian territory, the Kursk region, which is a public humiliation for any dictator. That's why the propaganda tries to hush it up as much as they can. And the message that I was trying to convey from the first days of this war, and the last TV interview I did before my arrest, which was actually with an American channel, with NBC, on the 10th of April, 2022, by video from Moscow. I was arrested on the 11th. I said that, whatever happens, Vladimir Putin must not be allowed to emerge triumphant from the war in Ukraine, because if he is, then that means a year or a year and a half down the road, we'll be talking about something else. Another invasion, another aggression, another war, because that man is not going to stop. We know what he's like. He's been there for 25 years. And I still want to repeat that message today. Vladimir Putin must not be allowed to emerge victorious or triumphant, because that would be just the most catastrophic outcome for everybody.
Part of this, in the West at least, is about disinformation, misinformation, lack of understanding, at times being focused on other things like a U.S. presidential election and whatnot. And we have a couple of questions here about what can be done to stop or to avoid or to see through Russian disinformation campaigns. What would you advise?
Well, first of all, thank you for the question, because information is key to this, right? Putin's regime has ruled over 25 years basically by only two methods: repression and propaganda. Repression and propaganda. This year marks half a century since the publication of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's famous manifesto, Live Not by Lies. It was published in 1974, the day he was arrested, before he would be expelled from the Soviet Union. And in that work, you remember he famously wrote that lies have nothing to enforce themselves by except violence, and violence has nothing to cover itself by except lies. Those two pillars are interconnected, and this is how Putin rules. This is what this regime is founded on. And so this question of disinformation or propaganda is the key one. I've studied extensively the history of not just the Soviet dissident movement, but sort of the Cold War history writ large. And I remember coming across studies, both Western, but also importantly Soviet, that were declassified after 1991, showing that up to 15% of the adult population of the Soviet Union in the Soviet times were listening to the radio broadcasts from Radio Liberty, from Voice of America, Deutsche Welle, the BBC, and all these other Western radio stations that were, beaming their shortwave signals across the Iron Curtain to reach tens of millions of people inside the Soviet Union and other Soviet bloc countries. And to me, this was one of the most important and decisive factors in the collapse of the communist regime, because those teenagers who were listening to Radio Liberty broadcasts in the late 70s, early 80s, were the adults who stood at the barricades at the Moscow White House in 1991. Change can only come from the inside. It cannot be imposed from somewhere. Change in Russia can only come from Russian society. And to me, one of the biggest factors of the collapse of the communist regime in 1991 was the fact that the Soviet regime was delegitimized in the eyes of a large number of its own citizens who had access to the truth, because nothing beats propaganda and lies as effectively as the truth. And so if this was done, if this was possible to do with the technologies of the 1970s, it's surely possible to do today, but we need more political will. Because frankly, well, at least in the 3 months that I've been out of prison, as much as I can judge, there's not enough attention to this being paid in the democratic world. But that is something that is absolutely crucial, because however astonishing this may come out sounding for citizens of free countries in the 21st century, a very large part of the Russian population is not even aware of the horrors that are being committed by Putin's regime in Ukraine, because all they get is Putin's propaganda. All the independent media have been closed down. All the social media have been blocked. There are tens of thousands of internet websites that have been blocked since the start of the full-scale invasion. And instead of helping Russian citizens gain access to truthful information, we often see, for example, Western companies actually being complicit in Putin's propaganda. Just within this past month, Apple, at the request of the Putin government, has removed 98 different VPN services that allow you to go around these blockages from the App Store. And 2 weeks ago, Apple, at the request of the Putin government, removed all the apps from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. How is this happening? So not only are these Western entities not helping the Russian people get access to information. They're actually helping the Putin regime censor it. And just a sort of a small illustration of how important that truthful information is. When I was first arrested in 2022, I was initially in a cell of 6 people, right? They sort of kept reducing the numbers. I think it was 6, then 4, then 2, then solitary confinement until August. But initially it was 6 people. And this was just sort of, a cross-section of just average people who for years and years have been exposed to the Putin propaganda machine. And so you can imagine what they were saying about the Ukraine war. They were saying that what they were told to say by the propaganda. And, I tried to be as patient as I could. And I tried to explain what's actually happening and to sort of lay down some of the facts and talk about, the reality of this as opposed to these myths that put up by Putin's propaganda. After about 3 or 4 weeks, everybody else in that prison cell thought the same that I think about the war in Ukraine. Not because I said anything brilliant or genius, I didn't. I just gave them the facts. And it is crucially important to give the Russian people the facts about this. And so there should be more efforts in providing truthful information in the Russian language. And nobody would do it as well as independent Russian journalists, many of whom are now in exile and operating these media outlets like Meduza and Novaya Gazeta and TV Rain and Echo and others. This is a crucial front in this battle, because there's not going to be any strategic solution to this war or to any other wars that Putin may conduct down the line without a change of government in Russia. This is the only end game in this. Only when Russia will have a democratically elected government that will respect the rights and freedoms of its own people, only then will it abide by the civilized norms of international behavior and no longer be a threat to its neighbors. Those things are connected.
Let me pick this up about the international community, bouncing off of that. We've just had an election in the United States, so there's a receptiveness right now or at least lots of people are giving advice right now. In other words, this is what should be done. And it would be that way regardless of who had won the election. So what advice would you give to the United States and other Western governments, both specifically in terms of the Ukraine war and Russia, but on a larger scale, we've seen many of the so-called BRICS, that second tier of rising countries, places like India, places like Indonesia, places like South Africa, places like Turkey, of course, Brazil and others, that have been more and more attracted to this authoritarian playbook over the past decade rather than the norms of democratic life. How do we counter that as well?
Well, I wouldn't presume, of course, to give any advice to any leaders in particular, but I would just convey a very simple message: to stand on values. This is what distinguishes the democratic world from all these other countries where people don't have the right to freely elect their government, where people don't have the right to freely express their will, where people don't have the right to decide their own country's future. The international component is crucial to this, because we know, on the one hand, what the policy of appeasement by Chamberlain and Daladier led to in the 1930s. And on the other hand, we know how important was the principled stand taken by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the 80s to bringing about the collapse of the communist tyranny. So the international context of this is really important. And I just hope that the leaders of Western democracies on both sides of the Atlantic find that in themselves to actually practice what they preach, to defend the same values on which their own countries are based on the international level, and to apply these principles, have no double standard, and to finally stop. I mean, we are talking about this 25 years after Putin came to power, but as they say, better late than never. To finally stop enabling and appeasing and cutting deals with this dictator, usurper, and murderer who is sitting in the Kremlin. To anyone out there in the Western sort of political circles who advocates for going back to business as usual with Vladimir Putin, for finding some sort of a compromises with Vladimir Putin. Well, first of all, for an aggressor like Putin, compromise is not an invitation to reciprocate, it's an invitation to grab even more and to be more aggressive. But also just on a very basic level. This is not just a dictator, this is not just an authoritarian, it's not just somebody who's corrupt. This is literally a murderer, in a very literal sense. And anybody in Western political circles who advocates going back to business as usual and who wants to shake hands with Vladimir Putin would be shaking hands with a murderer. I think it's important to remember that.
In one of the interviews that you gave shortly after being released in August, you talked about the difference between democracies that value human life, that their number one job, what gives them their moral worth, is the valuing of human life. And this comes back to a question earlier, but it's been asked in a different way, and it has to do with this lack of valuing of human life by Putin, by his associates and things, and whether or not that's an elite problem or if there's a larger cultural problem there. Often this same criticism is made, for instance, in China, that it's not just a leadership elite, but it's a culture that doesn't value human life or doesn't value it enough. Is that an accurate assessment, or is it really the case that if those 3 days come and this regime falls, that there's an opportunity not just for juridical means, not just for legislative means, but really for a culture of human dignity and life to express itself?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. The phrase that you quoted from me was that when we had our meeting with Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, on the evening of the exchange, sitting there. So there were 16 prisoners released as part of that exchange from the Russian side. And we're all flown to Turkey, but then the 3 Americans were flown here. And the 13 Russians and Germans, we were flown to Germany and had a meeting. So here, the president, vice president met the American citizens, and there the German chancellor met us at the tarmac. And I knew already by then, and I know even more so now, that the German chancellor was getting a lot of criticism for this decision to engage in this exchange, because in order to get us, they had to release Putin's assassin, an FSB hitman who was serving prison time in Germany. He was getting a lot of criticism in the press, like from opposition in parliament and so on. And this is exactly what I said to him. I said that I do understand that this was a very difficult decision, no question about it. But democracy comes with difficult decisions, right? Easy decisions are for dictatorships, where everything's decided, like this, on a whim, or the snap of a finger, because of expediency or benefit or realpolitik or whatever, by one person. But what also, to me, distinguishes a democracy from dictatorship is that there is nothing more valuable and more important than a democracy than human life. And by releasing that FSB hitman, the German and the US governments have saved 16 human lives from the hell that is Vladimir Putin's modern day Gulag. And that was the point I was making, and this is the context for this. But to your second point, unfortunately, that is in our culture and our tradition, that the value of human life in Russia has traditionally been very low. This has been the case under Tsarist times and communist times. It's still the case today. But to me, again, as a historian, if something has been happening for a long time, does not mean that it's inevitable or that it's going to be there forever. We know of many countries in the world that until fairly recently were living with authoritarian regimes and were dismissed as hopeless for democracy. I mean, look, just a few decades ago, within all of our lifespans, Brazil, Spain, South Korea seemed as distant from democracy as, Russia or Venezuela or Belarus are today. But it sort of worked out there, didn't it? And so nothing is inevitable. Nothing is sort of precluded. And so to me, actually, one of the main priorities, one of the most important tasks for a future post-Putin democratic government in Russia will be to try to change that part of the culture where human life is not valued. Because again, to me, as a Christian, but also somebody who believes in democracy, there's no higher value than human life.
Last question, and it picks up on what you just said. Use the word priorities. What about hope? What gives you hope in this? And are there signs of hope? Are there things that we're looking at? They may just be very, very tenuous right now, very, very young. What gives you hope?
Rather than philosophize, I'll give you one specific example. So in February and March of this year, we had a so-called presidential election in Russia, where you had Putin and a couple of pre-approved clowns running alongside him on the ballot to imitate competition. And of course, if you listen to Putin's propaganda machine, everybody in Russia supports the regime. Everybody in Russia supports the war. Everybody in Russia shares Putin's imperialistic ressentiment. Like Russian society is this monolith, that all things the same. That's what you hear on TV and radio. And bizarrely, even some people in the West sort of take that at face value. But certainly that's a message that you're supposed to, hear every day in Russia. And then in February of this year, so the quote-unquote election was, I think it was March 17th, about a month before in February, amid this sort of staged circus and unanimity of the so-called presidential election, there was one guy, his name is Boris Nadezhdin. He's a lawyer, a former member of parliament, back in the day when we still had one, who said that he was running for president as an anti-war candidate. That he was against the war and he wants to run for president of Russia. He called the war in Ukraine a fatal mistake, but he would end it on day one. And you wouldn't believe the public reaction. Suddenly, everywhere across Russia, large cities, small towns, you had these long lines of people, 2, 3, 4 hours, people waiting in line to sign the nominating petitions to get that guy on the ballot. Because by Russian law, you have to have a certain number of signatures to get somebody on the ballot. And of course, he was not allowed on the ballot. Needless to say, opposition candidates in Putin's Russia never are. But that was almost besides the point. Because suddenly, everyone saw through that lie perpetrated by Putin's propaganda that everybody supported the war. Because, you can rig election results, you can rig opinion poll numbers, but you can't rig videos or photos of thousands of people standing in lines to sign those nominating papers. And almost all of the letters I was receiving in prison in February were about those long lines from all over the country, from towns and cities I'd never been to, from people I'd never met. And they were writing how important it was for them. And I'll never forget this letter one young woman wrote to me from Novorossiysk. It's a town in the south of Russia on the Black Sea. And she was describing how she waited for 2 or 3 hours in that line of like-minded people, mostly young people, to sign the nominating petitions for this anti-war candidate. And she ended that letter by saying, I never realized how many of us there are. What gives me hope are the people of my country. I know that, there are many decent, good-hearted people in Russia who reject Putin and Putinism, who reject this war of aggression, who want Russia to be a normal, modern, European democratic country. As a historian, I have no doubt that day will come, because as they say, the arc of history may not bend as fast as we like, but it definitely does bend towards liberty. I know that day will come. As a politician, I try to do everything in my power to bring that day a little closer.
Wow. Well, Mr. Kara-Murza, you have informed us, you've challenged us, you've inspired us. And we'll end with a note from one of the students, actually, who's in the audience today that says, thank you for being here. I'm so glad you're here and that you're safe. I'm a big fan. I think we all echo that. Godspeed.